Metatron says that the ancient historians called the ancestors of the Irish and the Scottish insular Celts.
However, when they talk about the Picts and the Scots specifically, at least Mela, and I think Pomponius Mela 100%, maybe Caesar, but don't quote me on that, they tell us that they are redheaded. In fact, they use it as a distinctive feature. They say, oh yeah, the insular Celts, that's how they call them because to them they're all Celts. The insular Celts, they're red.
But someone in the chat named J-Boss disputes that.
Disagree with that, J-Boss. We can go down with the sources one day if you want, but yeah, I would disagree with that.
So let's go down with the sources today. The British, for example, were never called Celts. Source: Barry Cunliffe, The Celts, BBC Series Episode 1, In the Beginning, 49 minutes, 22 seconds.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
Because classical writers did not call the inhabitants of Britain and Ireland Keltoi or Keltai. Source: John Coke, Celtic Culture, A Historical Encyclopedia, Simon James, The Atlantic Celts, Ancient People of Modern Invention, John Collis, The Celts, Origins, Myths, and Inventions.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
There is no evidence whatsoever that any ancient people in the British Isles ever styled themselves as Celts. Source: Identifying Ancient Peoples as Celts.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
No ancient author ever identified any of the peoples of the British Isles as Keltoi or Keltai. Source: John P. Considine, Small Dictionaries and Curiosity.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
The terms Celts and Celtic were evidently not applied until modern times. Source: John T. Coke, Celtic Culture, A Historical Encyclopedia, Introduction.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
Their speakers were not called Keltoi or the like in the Greek and Roman accounts. Source: John T. Coke, Celtic Culture, A Historical Encyclopedia, page 89.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
It was never used for the inhabitants of the British Isles. Source: John Collis, The Celts, Origins, Myths, and Inventions, page 223.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
It must be admitted that classical authors never called the inhabitants of Britain and Ireland Keltoi/Keltai, or, for that matter, Galatai/Gali. Source: Kim McCone, The Celts, Questions of Nomenclature and Identity.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
The only peoples known to either themselves or their neighbors as Celts lived entirely on the continent. Source: Simon James, An Alternative History of Celticness.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
Until then, the term Celt had been applied only to the Celtic peoples of the European continent, not to the tribes of Britain and Ireland. Source: The Celts, Europe's People of Iron.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
Britain is never referred to by ancient authors as Celtic. Source: The Celtic World.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
No classical author ever referred to the inhabitants of the British Isles as Celts. Source: Stephen Oppenheimer, A Reanalysis of Multiple Prehistoric Immigrations to Britain and Ireland aimed at identifying the Celtic contributions.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
Nobody in them, however, is called a Celt by any ancient author. Source: CFC Hawkes, An Approach to the Insular Celts.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
The British were never explicitly called Celts in Greco-Roman texts. Source: Imagining the Celts.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
The British Isles were never called Celtic during the Middle Ages, or even before that. Source: Imagining the Celts.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
Neither the term Keltoi nor Gali was ever used to describe inhabitants of the British Isles. Source: Imagining the Celts.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
There are areas that were never regarded as Celtic by classic authors, such as Ireland and Britain. Source: Imagining the Celts.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
Surprisingly, neither the Greek Keltoi nor the Latin Keltai referred to the populations of the British Isles. Source: Myths and Legends of the Celts.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
When we come to the people of Britain and Ireland, during the Roman period, nobody called them Celts. Source: Saxons, Vikings, and Celts, the genetic roots of Britain and Ireland.
That's how they call them because to them they're all Celts.
Neither is there any record of anyone from the Isles using the word Celt to describe themselves until the 18th century. Source: Saxons, Vikings, and Celts, the genetic roots of Britain and Ireland.
That's how they call them, because to them they're all Celts.
That the ancient authors never referred to the ancient British or Irish as Celts. Source: The Origins of the Irish.
That's how they call them, because to them they're all Celts.
There is not the slightest glimmer of recognition that the Celts of Ireland were Celts. Source: Ian MacNeill, quoted in The Origins of the Irish.
That's how they call them, because to them they're all Celts.
Nor do we have any reason to suppose that populations in Britain or Ireland ever imagined themselves to be Celts. Source: The Origins of the Irish. But Ephorus, despite their distance from the Celts, Hecataeus and Herodotus both distinguish them from their immediate neighbors, the Ligurians and Cynesians, or Canesians, respectively, and are thus more useful to us than some later writers, such as Ephorus, circa 400 to 330 BC, who used the term Keltoi in a generalized, schematic way, assigning the 4 points of the compass to Indians, Ethiopians, Celts, and Scythians. This shorthand should not be taken out of its astronomical context, as it is by modern scholars who deduce that the Keltoi were just the Western, non-Greek other. Just as Ephorus can hardly have imagined that the East and South were solely occupied by Indians and Ethiopians, without Persians, Egyptians, etc., so he cannot be assumed to have believed that only Celts inhabited his Celtic quadrant. In fact, in another context, he distinguished between Celts and Iberians, although getting their relative proportions wrong, according to Josephus and Strabo. Other early Greek writers, including Timageus, Timaeus, and Apollonius of Rhodes, also regard the Celts as a distinct people. Source: Sims Williams, Patrick. The Location of the Celts according to Hecataeus, Herodotus, and other Greek writers, 2016. But Patrick Sims Williams, on Pythias Reconsidered. Sims Williams says, the Celtoskeptic argument that the insular ancient Celts never existed because no ancient source ever called insular people Celts has to be abandoned because Pythias referred to the Britons whom he encountered in the 4th century BC as Keltoi, despite Strabo correcting them and saying that they were Brittonoi and not Keltoi. Strabo himself refuted that label. Among those who are 6,300 states from Marseille, whom Hipparchus, considers to be Keltoi, but I think are Brittonoi, 2,500 states farther north of Celtica, this solar phenomenon occurs more plainly, and the winter sun rises only 6 cubits. So if Celtoskepticism must abandon any argument, it is not the argument that the insular ancient Celts never existed, but rather that the insular peoples were never called Celts incorrectly, which Sims Williams has shown to be false. Indeed, the insular peoples were called Celts incorrectly by Pythias, according to Hipparchus, according to Strabo, and corrected by Strabo that he thought them to be Brittonoi instead of Keltoi. Otherwise, no, there should not be any historical attestation where British or Irish tribes or people are referred to as either insular Celts or Celts. That same user also called Metatron's work sloppy. He said simply untrue, sloppy. Here's Metatron's reaction.
You're gonna get blocked, J-Boss. I don't appreciate being insulted. You're out. I don't even care. Hide user from this channel. Shame on you.
Hunter Galvaro's moving away.
However, this is Metatron's reaction to Metatron himself calling someone toxic. Not their work, but their personality.
Did he get offended because I called him toxic? Could you imagine that? So,
So someone should not be expected to be offended at being called toxic, according to Metatron, but someone should be expected to be blocked from his chat for calling his work sloppy. Incidentally, this is his justification for calling the Irish and Scottish Celts. You decide whether it is sloppy.
In fact, the Gauls, when we talk about the Gauls, they are 100% Celtic. And then the Gauls, that's like beyond any discussion. We can talk about insular differences, because there are, but there is absolutely no question that the Gauls are considered Celtic, because in fact, when we are told about Gallia, we are told that they call themselves like this, but we call them like that. So they give us two different names, nomenclature. But then again, the Celtic Druids from Gallia went to Britannia to learn from those Celtic Druids. So how can they go and learn? It was like an Erasmus in ancient Rome, in ancient Gallia or Gallic tribes. They would go and study with the Druids in Britannia. So if they are not Celtic populations, then how would they learn? How would they be compatible? Ora.
So because Caesar told us that some Gauls, a third of them actually, not 100% as Metatron said, called themselves Celts, and because someone told us Celtic Druids from Gallia went to Britannia to learn from those Druids, therefore this justifies calling the ancestors of the Irish and the Scottish Celts. After all, otherwise, in Metatron's words, how can they go and learn if they're not Celtic populations? How would they learn? How would they be compatible? In other words, if the ancestors of the Irish and the Scottish were not themselves Celts, then how could they possibly welcome Gauls to learn from them? How can American universities take international students if those international students aren't themselves Americans? But whatever. For good information about the Celts, please watch The Kelt Show.